everyone, it's me, Dr. E. Welcome to this special three-part blog post series that I am creating specifically for medical billers and coders. I am a chiropractor. I've been practicing since 1991 and most recently in Norfolk, Virginia. And I primarily have been creating courses and boot camps for chiropractors and other providers to help them with compliant documentation. But when you're dealing with insurance carriers and you have auditing for documentation, God, right? Hey everybody, it's me, Dr. E, Dr. Ellen Fitzenreiter, a chiropractor in Norfolk, Virginia, and welcome to my special three-part blog series specifically for insurance medical billers and coders, whether or not you work for individual providers, a larger facility, whether you work for a billing company, whether you work for a legal firm that helps represent healthcare providers regarding documentation issues. This is just for you guys, and I'll talk to you in just a second about why I'm doing and what I'm doing. But first, I'm going to give you the title for this part one is Interpreting and Responding to Documentation Error Codes. All right, so I have been a chiropractor for almost 30 years. I built and sold two successful chiropractic practices, and most recently, my former office was subjected to an insurance carrier audit, which sort of breaks down into two parts. You have a post-payment review of documentation for claims that have already been paid in the past, and more often than not, that audit, which can take 6 months, it can take a year for them to review your documentation, depending on how much they have asked for, how many patient files, and what span of time. And mine lasted 6 months. And following that audit, they may or may not ask you for money back, but usually they will try to put you on prepayment review, which means that future claims, if they have found issues with your documentation, that you have to send in paper claim forms and all of your paper notes. And before they pay you, they want to make sure that your documentation is compliant. And that means compliant per the carrier guidelines, not necessarily what your healthcare provider states they decide as medical necessity. Your carrier guidelines determine medical necessity. So primarily over the past year, I've been working with chiropractors and other providers with compliant boot camps, and I'm currently turning my boot camp into a self-paced webinar style course that will be released in the spring of 2020. And while I'm doing that, I am reaching out to you guys because you can't address what happens with compliance and documentation for the providers without also talking about what happens on the billing side of going through a prepayment review, because myself and dozens of other chiropractors that were audited during the same time span in Virginia were kind of paralyzed because we didn't know what to do with the codes and how to respond and how quickly to respond and the information to ask for. We couldn't find it, and that's why I am sharing it with you guys now. So what happened is there was not really a protocol for response. There was varied information that different billing codes and experts gave us that still honestly, when you go for 6 months and you don't get paid, something's not getting figured out. Things that I know now that I didn't know then, which is what I'm sharing with you. There's lack of communication between chiropractors. We did reach out to our association. We had a specialist. A lot of chiropractors just didn't share that they were going through audit because they're embarrassed. They don't want other providers to think they did something wrong, and being in a state of audit does not necessarily mean that you did anything wrong, although most providers are less than compliant. Chiropractors are 82%. I understand that probably psychotherapists are about the same thing. I haven't delved too deep into the different other health disciplines, but compliance is an issue across the board in the healthcare provider feed. So what I'm going to share with you now first is about the responding to the error codes, like I said. So your EOBs, normally are used to responding to specific codes that may say that there's a missing modifier or something with bundling or there wasn't something added. And it's more to do on the billing end, and you can correct it and resubmit that. The problem with the documentation denial codes is they're normally unfamiliar. They're not, almost 30 years, and I always had my fingers dabbling in what was going in and out with my EOBs at the front desk, and I can read my EOBs as good as any of my billing people could, because if you don't keep your eye on it, stuff happens. I learned that over the years. So these were unfamiliar codes. They were vague, and I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. And we did not respond to them like I know we should have now. They usually indicate that a provider or facility is in some state of audit review, and that is different from pre-authorization required for certain services. So if these codes right at this moment are not applicable to you and the office that you serve or offices that you serve, please remember to come back to this if you ever end up in a scenario where you're helping an office go through documentation audits, because this will apply at that point in time, and you know that it will always be on my blog as a resource. The documentation denial codes require immediate follow-up, and that is what I'm going to share with you right now. So for example, these are the denial codes that came through on our Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield EOBs from the beginning of my prepayment review audit. And as you can see, they are various phrases about needing medical records to support services, need medical support services, determine benefits. There's procedure code on there. So in an audit circumstance, documentation probably has been submitted already. So what happened to my office, as well as all these other docs offices that we were going through this together, is we were all getting these denial codes, these error codes on our EOBs. We had sent the documentation in, and our interpretation of these codes was that even though we got an EOB back, that the documentation hadn't been read yet. Because honestly, when you're sending in pages of notes for every single date of service every week for every person that you see, we were sending off USPS, bundles an inch thick of paperwork. And I just assumed, our office just assumed, and everybody else's did, it was taking them time to go through the paperwork that we were sending in. So we sat and waited. We waited for the documentation to get read and waited for new EOBs to give us a specific reason why claims were denied. And those EOBs never came. And finally, after 3 months, so here we go. After multiple months, I finally called my auditor and said, "You guys need to read my records. You need to either pay me, approve the claims and pay me, or you need to deny them, and you give me a reason, because this is not a reason." They had the medical records and they denied us for these reasons. And when at first, the auditor said that he had nothing to do with the prepayment review department. He had to do with the original post-payment review audit. And then when I pushed him, he said, "Well, all of your claims have been denied, and here's the report." And I'm going to put that picture of that report in part 2, because it will blow your mind. But it was a 130-page spreadsheet of all of the dates of service that I had seen for the past 4 months with specific denial reasons. Blew my mind. And I asked my auditor, "Pray tell, what is the name of this report and how are providers to access this?" And he told me that there is no name for this report and there is no way for providers to access it except to ask me for it. And yet at the same time, your auditors will tell you that they don't have anything to do with that. So does that sound fishy to you? Sounds fishy to me. It was. So there, when I mentioned about responding immediately, if you receive an EOB with a denial code that says need medical records, your paperwork has been read. You need to immediately reach out to your auditor and you ask for the denials report. Might be called the denials detail report. You may have to ask them some other way to describe it because different carriers may call it different things, but there are reasons they're being denied and you need to ask for it because it's not going to be on that EOB. All right, so now this is all going to boil down to medical necessity. So your provider's documentation must demonstrate medical necessity according to the carrier's guidelines. I will tell you a little secret is most providers have not read their carrier's guidelines. This is a sample of carrier guidelines, and it's going to talk about two different things. It's going to talk about what, which is patient specific. This patient, the first section you can see here, has more to do with what's going on with the patient and what the findings are and subjective and the typical SOAP things that you're used to seeing. The second part of the guidelines is going to explain to you how they want you to say what they want to say. So you can screenshot this if you want. I'm not giving this as an example of a specific carrier. If your office participates in multiple carriers, insurance carriers, they'll each have different guidelines. They tend to follow Medicare. So you probably heard that for years. They're following Medicare, but they will all have their specifics. You need to get them and print them out, and your provider needs to, here we go, about the how, the what and the how. Your provider needs to be familiar with the guidelines. You need to be, it's the SOAP content specific to patient care, and then the actual structure of the notes. This is also going to sort of tie into your electronic health records with the macros that are set up and the buttons that the provider clicks in order to populate the notes. And that's going to be in part 2 that's coming up, lots about that. But I will say that you will often hear specialists and billing companies and different documentation seminars talk about the number one reason why claims are denied is because the documentation is not signed. And that is true. However, that's not all of the story. You saw those guidelines earlier, a couple slides back, and you'll see how many things have to be in the notes. Many providers do not sign. They save, but they do not sign their documentation. And so the first thing that auditors look for is to see if there's a signature, a date and a signature on that note. That has to be signed within 48 hours. If it's not signed, you just gave them a really easy way to deny that claim. They won't even look past that. So for docs who do sign their notes, they hear this statement that the number one reason that claims are denied is because the documentation is signed. Providers who sign their notes get complacent. They think, well, I signed my notes, so I'm probably good. Au contraire, mon frère, as they say in French with a really bad accent, is if a provider does not sign their documentation, chances are they haven't read their guidelines, because otherwise they would know they have to sign their documentation. And chances are they're probably wrong. They're probably non-compliant in 20 or 30 things. So it's extremely important that somebody in the office, it does not have to be the provider, somebody in the office, call all the carriers, get all the guidelines. Provider's going to have to look at them, but you're going to have to look at them too. That's going to be part 2. And so thank you for joining me for part 1. The long webinar is going to be on March 4th, 2020. Make sure you register for that. The link will be up in the blog post, or if you're seeing this on YouTube, if it's after March 4th, you will be able to see a link for it elsewhere on my webpage. And rock on, rock stars. You are the frontline billers and coders, because you get this in, and where the provider's primary job is to be the healthcare provider, your primary job is to get this paid and troubleshoot those problems and get this done. So that's why I'm talking to you guys, because I think you guys are the ones who are going to hear me. You want to hear the message. All right, have a great day. Bye-bye.